Let's be clear about what's actually happening here, because the reality is more nuanced than any headline suggests. Rory McIlroy is currently leading the Masters tournament and playing exceptional golf through the first 2 rounds. He looks comfortable, confident, and completely in control on a golf course that has historically given him trouble. His approach shots are precise, his putting stroke is solid, and he's navigating Augusta's challenges with a level of mastery that suggests deep familiarity with every slope, break, and grain on the property. That comfort and familiarity is exactly what's creating tension among other competitors. According to multiple sources speaking anonymously, several players in the Masters field have raised concerns about Rory's access to Augusta National in the months leading up to the tournament. Specifically, they're pointing to the fact that Rory was invited by members to play private rounds at Augusta multiple times before tournament week, giving him opportunities to study the course under conditions most competitors never experience. Now, here's the crucial point that needs to be emphasized. What Rory did is completely allowed within the rules governing the Masters. Augusta National is a private club, and members can invite guests to play rounds whenever they choose. There's no regulation preventing players from accepting those invitations, and Rory violated absolutely nothing by taking advantage of opportunities offered to him. This is not a cheating scandal in any traditional sense. Nobody's accusing Rory of breaking rules or acting dishonestly. If you want to understand why this is still controversial despite being legal, hit that like button and subscribe, because the dynamics here reveal something important about competitive fairness in golf. The concerned players are expressing centers on competitive advantage rather than rule violations. Augusta National is unlike any other golf course on the planet. The greens are faster and more sloped than standard tour setups. The way balls react on approach shots, how putts breaking, where you can and cannot land balls on certain holes, all of that knowledge is incredibly valuable and difficult to acquire without actually playing the course repeatedly. Most players in the Masters field get their Augusta experience during tournament week through practice rounds and the limited opportunities the club provides. Some players who've competed there for years have built up knowledge through repeated appearances, but that's experience earned through qualifying and competing, which everyone respects as fair. What's different about private member guest rounds is that they provide course knowledge without requiring competitive qualification or equal access. One player, speaking anonymously to golf media, essentially said that the more time you get on that course before the tournament, the bigger your competitive edge becomes. And when you watch Rory's performance through 2 rounds, the comfort level he's showing seems to validate that concern. He's hitting approaches to perfect spots, reading putts with confidence, and generally playing like someone who's seen these exact situations many times before. The frustration among competitors isn't directed at Rory personally, as much as it's about the broader issue of unequal access creating competitive imbalances. Golf prides itself on being a sport where everyone competes on level playing fields, where preparation and skill determine outcomes rather than connections or privileged access. When some players have opportunities to practice at major championship venues that others don't, it challenges that fundamental principle. What makes this situation particularly complicated is that it involves tradition clashing with modern competitive standards. Augusta National has always operated with a level of exclusivity and privacy that's central to its identity. Member guest privileges, private rounds, and the club's autonomous operations separate from PGA Tour control are all part of what makes the Masters unique. Changing those traditions to create more equal access would fundamentally alter the character of the event. But from a competitive perspective, those traditions create advantages that have nothing to do with golf skill. If player A has connections that get him invited for multiple private rounds and player B doesn't, they're not preparing for the same tournament on equal footing. That's the tension players are now voicing, and it's not an easy problem to solve without disrupting traditions that many believe are essential to what makes the Masters special. Reports indicate that some players have discussed bringing these concerns to the PGA Tour, not because the tour has jurisdiction over Augusta National, which it doesn't, but because it could spark broader conversations about preparation standards for major championships. Ideas being floated include clearer guidelines about pre-tournament access, or at least more transparency about who's playing private rounds, so everyone knows what kind of preparation their competitors are getting. However, there's significant division among players about whether this is even a problem that needs solving. Veterans and traditionalists argue that connections have always mattered in golf, that networking and relationships are part of professional sports, and that if you're fortunate enough to get invited to play Augusta privately, you should absolutely take that opportunity. From this perspective, Rory did nothing wrong and actually did exactly what any smart competitor would do when given access to valuable preparation opportunities. The counter-argument is that major championships should be competitions where golf skill determines outcomes, and that advantages derived from social connections rather than athletic ability undermine competitive integrity. This perspective doesn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but argues that the system itself creates unfair advantages that should be addressed. What's particularly interesting is how this conversation is playing out publicly versus privately. Publicly, very few players are willing to go on record criticizing Rory or the situation because doing so risks looking like sour grapes or attacking someone for taking opportunities anyone would accept. Privately, the conversations are much more frank, with players expressing genuine frustration about competing against someone who's had preparation advantages they couldn't access, regardless of their own efforts or abilities. Rory himself hasn't addressed these concerns directly because, from his perspective, there's nothing to address. He was invited to play golf at a course, he accepted those invitations, and he prepared for a major championship using legal and available opportunities. Asking him to apologize or justify that preparation would be unreasonable. At the same time, his silence on the broader fairness questions means the conversation continues without his input, which allows speculation and frustration to build. The PGA Tour is in an awkward position because Augusta National operates independently, and the Tour has no authority to regulate member guest access or practice round policies. Any changes would have to come from Augusta itself, and the club is notoriously resistant to external pressure or suggestions about how it should operate. The Masters has maintained its traditions and autonomy for decades, and the likelihood of Augusta changing its policies because some Tour players are uncomfortable seems minimal. What could force change is if this controversy affects how the tournament is perceived by fans and media. If the narrative becomes that the Masters isn't a pure competition because some players get unfair preparation advantages, that damages the event's credibility in ways Augusta wouldn't want. The club cares deeply about the Masters being viewed as the pinnacle of golf competition, and anything that undermines that perception could potentially motivate policy adjustments. If Rory goes on to win the Masters, especially in dominant fashion, this conversation will intensify significantly. Critics will point to his preparation advantages as a factor in the victory, even if there's no way to prove how much it actually mattered. Rory's supporters will argue that he simply played the best golf and that trying to diminish his victory by pointing to practice rounds is unfair and disrespectful to his talent. The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle. Rory is genuinely playing excellent golf, executing shots and making putts that require tremendous skill regardless of preparation. But it's also reasonable to acknowledge that familiarity with Augusta's unique conditions provides advantages, and that not everyone has equal access to building that familiarity. Both things can be true simultaneously without either being a complete explanation for his performance. What this situation reveals is an ongoing